Tonight we're going to talk about the Crusades, but before I get into that, I want to go back a little bit and just kind of try to put a few things together, not necessarily in a timeline that I'm going to test you over, but more to try to pull things together and make sense, or maybe just put some things into place so that maybe it'll make more sense. Trying to tie in, the book tends to sort of pop around throughout the time period that you're talking about. So you'll start out at the beginning of something, and then in the next 2 or 3 paragraphs, you may be 200 or 300 years later. And I mean, it's just kind of, I mean, it's definitely compartmentalized, but on some level, it can feel like it's all over the place. So I just want to try to put a little bit of this together so that maybe it will make more sense and stick a little better. So I am going to do it kind of in a timeline form because that's because it helps me learn it that way. Hopefully it will help you too. So I'm just going to go back to 284 AD when that's when Diocletian divided the empire. Okay. Then in 324 AD, that's when Constantine does he makes his effort to try to reunite the empire, and he uses Christianity as one of his main tools to do that. But it doesn't really work. Around this time is when he takes not only the imperial capital, but also by default the religious capital, and moves it from Rome to Byzantium, and then renames it to Constantinople. All of that happens around 324. Well, then a little bit further, 395 AD, that's when Emperor Theodosius comes on the scene. And remember, he was the one who, this was the riots that happened in Thessalonica. So there was the big chariot races that happened at the Hippodrome there. And one of the main athletes that participated in that was arrested, and his arrest was basically going to make it so that he couldn't participate in the games, and it upset people pretty badly. There were some other things going on at the same time too, but this was sort of a tipping point. And so they began to protest and sort of riot. Well, in the midst of all of this, a couple of Roman soldiers ended up being killed. When word got back to Theodosius that those soldiers were killed, he got a little crazy, and he ordered his soldiers to march over to Thessalonica and just kill everybody in the whole city, just kill them all. Well, they took off, the soldiers did, and then he settles down, and he realizes that was a little bit of an overreaction. So then he sends word to stop the massacre, don't do it. Well, by the time that order reaches Thessalonica, 7,000 people had already been killed. Well, then word of that debacle reaches his religious superior, which at this point is Bishop Ambrose, right? And Ambrose is so upset with these actions that he basically excommunicates him, throws him out of the church, tells him he can't have communion. And Theodosius at first says, well, I don't really care, and he just moves on. But within a few months, he's going back to Ambrose, and he's saying, please, I'm sorry, I repent, allow me back into the church. And Ambrose actually doesn't allow it. Theodosius has to continue to come back over and over and over again asking for this sort of absolution. Well, Ambrose finally, I think after about 8 months, he finally allows him back into the church. But this, in 395, this was the first time that an imperial or a secular leader bowed to the religious authority, the Christian religious authority at the time. So it was a big first. So then, moving forward, and we didn't really discuss this until about last week, but about 410 AD, the emperor and the pope, who were centered in Rome, they actually fled Rome because all of these attacks were coming in from the outside, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There were these invaders coming in, and Rome was under threat. So the emperor and the pope both took off from Rome, and they went to this city called Ravenna. Ravenna becomes important. It happens that the attacks that they were avoiding were under Attila the Hun at this time. So they were just leaving the city in anticipation that the Huns were going to come in and sack the city and vandalize everything. Well, as you know, Leo met Attila the Hun outside the city walls, negotiated peace with him, and was sort of the hero of the day. Well, this is something we also didn't specifically discuss. So at this stage in the game, we have the entire Roman Empire, but it's been split east and west, right? The Western Empire where everything is centered in Rome. If you start looking into the history and you Google when did Rome fall or when did the Roman Empire end, or those kinds of questions, you find out that most of the sources will say that Rome fell in 476 AD. Okay, so the reason for that is because there were still all of these attacks going on. There were still all these threats to the area. And remember the plague, the Justinian plague had come through, and people were starting to die. Things were starting to happen that were not good. But the end result was that the military ranks were beginning to get depleted. And so because of that, they were having to fill the ranks with whoever they could, whoever was available and willing and healthy enough to do this. And they started to employ people from outside of the Roman Empire, foreigners, if you want to call it that. They started employing foreigners. Well, it turns out that these people who were coming into the armies to fight for Rome, they were more than willing to fight for Rome, and they did a good job, but they weren't necessarily loyal to Rome. They were just basically doing a job. Well, it turns out that one of these men, his name was Odoacer, Odoacer. You don't really need to know that, but his name is Odoacer. He's responsible in the year 476 for deposing what would be the last Roman emperor that was actually in Rome. He's the person that took him out, and he took over, and he was German, and he took over emperorship, if you want to call it that, of Rome. Many people, because the last Roman emperor, that was the last Roman emperor, that's why they call that the final fall of the Roman Empire. And now we're talking about Western, because remember, the Byzantium Empire is still happening. Constantinople's still alive, and all these cities, and the Western part of things is still alive. We're just talking about the fall of Rome, so to speak, okay? So that was, again, about 476. Well, that sort of ended the Roman Empire, at least the Western part of the Roman Empire, and that began the Byzantium Empire. Okay, so that starts at about 476, and it goes through 1453. So the Byzantium Empire lasts a very, very long time. And the Crusades are just kind of thrown into the middle of all this stuff. So up to this point, we've been not real picky about dates and timelines and things like that, but we've gone from looking at just a few hundred years at a time to now we're looking at hundreds of years at a time, like big periods of time. And inside of these periods of time, all of these little events are happening. And like when you're reading in the book, they're not necessarily chronological, and they're not necessarily organized in a timeline way. So I just want you to be aware that while we're talking about the Crusades or the Byzantine Empire or whatever, there is a lot of fluctuation back and forth as far as the chronology of the events, okay? So now we've entered the Byzantine Empire, and I've already mentioned it, but Justinian is emperor now. This is about 530, somewhere in that area. He and his wife Theodora, they're running things. And remember that not the claim to fame, it's not a necessarily positive thing, but the thing we talked about with Justinian was the people were beginning. So remember that the plague was coming through, the farming was starting to be affected, the economy was starting to be affected, certainly the ranks in the armies were being affected, and because that part of things, especially the farming and the produce, was going down, taxes were starting to go up to make up for the lack of income, and then and so the people were starting to get taxed. They didn't have as much food to sell. They weren't making as much money, and so all of these things were starting to just play a heavy role, really weigh heavily on the people. Plus the fact that the plague was coming through and it was wiping people out left and right. So, and remember, Justinian was the one who even though there weren't as many people, so to speak, there weren't as many farmers, there wasn't as much to farm, he was still imposing the same taxes on them, and he was actually asking for taxes to be paid by, for your neighbor. I mean, so he was being hard on the people. This started to create an unrest, and people were starting to, not necessarily riot, but they were starting to protest, and they were starting to ask for something to change. And remember, Theodosius, he invited everybody into that big Colosseum, and so hundreds of, like 100,000 people, it can hold 100,000 people. All these people came in, I don't know the total, but all these people came in, and under the pretense that there was going to be some sort of discussion or announcement or something in answer to these protests. And what he really did was set his soldiers loose on them, and he killed about 30,000 people inside of his own Colosseum. And this was one of the largest, it was one of the largest massacres of Roman citizens by its own government. So Justinian, that was one of the things we talked about with him. And again, that was in about 532. So Justinian was having, we kind of painted a poor picture of him, but he was under a lot of stress. He was trying to run this huge empire. He was being invaded on all these fronts on the outskirts of his empire. He's got Rome over here, at least for a period of time, a short period of time. He's got, they're asking for help because they have their own invaders going, and they're, asking for help from the main city in the east because they need protection. And then all these people are dying. He's obviously hated. They named the plague after him. He's taxing everybody. It's not working. People are starving. It's just, it's a bad time. But he was using this tax money to try to fortify his armies and at least keep the borders of the empire intact. But who was it that was attacking? Who was coming in? Who were these invaders that were posing such a threat to the empire as a whole? They were Germanic tribes, and the book mentions these but never really qualifies them and tells you who they are. These are the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. It's the Vandals, the Lombards, the Angles, the Saxons. So as you're reading through different chapters in the book, you'll just see 2 or 3 sentences where so-and-so was fighting the Saxons, and in this year, this person defeated the Lombards, and in this year, the Vandals came down, and whatever. All of these groups, they're all different groups, but they're all Germanic in origin, and they're just coming in, and as the empire is sort of weakening, especially in the West, but as the empire is weakening, they're just seeing an opportunity to come in and try to take some land, okay? So Justinian had many, many things to deal with, and just didn't always make the best decisions about what to do for his people. So these Germanic tribes, whenever they came in, they have some pretty interesting characteristics. They were definitely nomadic. They were polytheistic, so their clash with Christianity, they had the same issues with Christianity that any polytheistic society would. They just don't understand the idea of a single God. They looked very different. They were red-headed, blonde-headed, light-eyed, but they were very powerful. They were very physically fit and powerful, a very good fighting force. They liked to go to war more than they liked to work. They liked to drink. They liked to gamble. They liked, smoking and drinking and whatever. And most of the work, since they preferred war over work, most of the work was left to the women and the slaves that they had, whether they were, innate to their tribe or whether they were acquired as they were going through and conquering different areas. So, and that man, Odoacer, that I mentioned earlier, that deposed the last Roman emperor, he was from one of these tribes. I don't know which one, but he was one of those tribes. So he was one of the people who was recruited to come into the army and start fighting. He did. He fought, and he fought for Rome and did good things. And then one day he didn't, and he became sort of the ruler over Rome and was instrumental in what we would know as the fall of the Western Empire. So, and also the other thing I want to pull together real quick, so that area of Ravenna, so whenever the area around Rome was being threatened by different tribes, whoever they may be, remember I said that the emperor and the pope took off from Rome and went to a safe city, or what they felt was a safe city. It was the city of Ravenna. Well, as time went on, this city of Ravenna became very important. It became the administrative center of the Byzantine Empire. So there was a center in Constantinople that was certainly the religious and the imperial center, but this was an administrative center, and it was well guarded. Not necessarily wealthy, but it was protected because of its interest, because of the Byzantine government interest in what was happening there. All right, so that brings us up to the late 6th century, about 590. This was when we talked about Gregory the Great. That's whenever this little monk named Gregory was elected, if you want to call it that, into being the Pope. Gregory was very successful in many, many things. He was an excellent administrator. He effectively, because it was the Lombards that at his time were coming in and threatening to take Rome, and he was successful at going and negotiating with them and keeping Rome, and keeping them from coming in and sacking the city and vandalizing it and doing the things that you hear that they, have done to other areas. So he was successful in that, and he basically reorganized the papacy, and it was almost a cause and effect. His administration and the way that he ran things and the way that how successful he was at what he did, it sort of led into a reorganization of the papacy. And it gave him power that he never really asked for and never really wanted, but ended up having more imperial power than what a religious leader had up to that point. Simply because, for the same reason that Leo ended up having some power, it just didn't stretch out very far. He had power with his people because they loved him, because he saved them. But Gregory actually had some influence over parts of the near empire because of his administrative successes with the Lombards. Well, that was the end of the 500s, about 590. Well, by 750, so just a couple hundred years later, the Lombards are still in the area, and they're now again threatening to take over Rome. And the scary thing about this particular threat was that they had now taken over the city of Ravenna. So the Lombards had taken this administrative center, and now they were heading for Rome. So it became a little bit more serious once Ravenna was taken. Well, Rome began to very seriously appeal to Constantinople. And I don't really know what that means. I have to tell you, we're talking about a great distance between this area of Rome and Constantinople. whenever I say that they're sending word and trying to get reinforcements brought in, I have no idea how long it takes to get that word to them, and then for them to make a decision, and then for them to actually respond to it. When you read the history, I can't help but think in terms of how I live now. Call them, ask for help, and they're here in a couple of hours. It didn't work that way. So I don't know what the time frames are here. They're longer than what I can express or what I can understand. But the reason I say that is because whenever Rome was asking for help, they basically didn't get it. Now, why they didn't get it? Was it because Constantinople was worrying about its own business? They had their own battles to fight. They had their own issues to deal with. They had their own problems. So maybe they couldn't spare it. Maybe word never got to them. I'm not sure why Constantinople didn't respond, but they didn't. So Rome was left in a position of being under what they felt was imminent attack without any reinforcements from the empire. So what Rome did was they went and they asked for help. They appealed for help from Pepin the Short. And remember, he was Charlemagne's dad, right? So they went to him and said, we're not getting the help we need. We need protection. Will you help us with the fighting off the Lombards? And so Pippin agrees, and again, remember that there were heavy taxes being imposed on all of these cities by Constantinople, and so between the heavy taxes and the lack of help, those are the two things that are cited most for why they went to Pippin. But Pippin agreed to help, and he went through, he retook Ravenna from the Lombards, he recaptured Ravenna, and then this area, I don't know if you've ever looked online to see what the area of the Papal States looks like. It's a pretty large area. But what he did was, Pepin not only took Ravenna, but he ended up having control over this big, huge area that was all around Rome, and he gifted that entire landmass to the Church of Rome. And it was called the Donation of Pippin. And at that point, it was called the Papal States. Once Rome or the church owned that land, it was known as the Papal States. Now, it's funny because one of the questions I asked myself was, why did Pippin agree to do this? And why would he give such a huge landmass? And you can get all kinds of theories. But one of the most interesting things I read, and I don't know that it's true, but one of the most interesting things I read was one of the things that this one historian believes influenced heavily Pepin's decision to give the papal lands to the church was that the donation of Constantine, that forged document that we learned about way in the beginning of our class, our time together, that was not known as a forgery at this time. And there are historians that believe that document, which gave land to the church, was instrumental in Pippin's decision to basically not just give, but re-give or give back the land that they already owed. So that's interesting, right? I thought that was cool. So anyway, so then we did talk a little bit about Charlemagne, is in reference to the sort of timeline I'm going through. His contribution by 774, the Lombards had come in again and tried to threaten to take Rome. Charlemagne absolutely wiped them all out. For the last time, the Lombards were no longer a threat to Rome. Charlemagne took care of it, and that was that. Not only did he keep them out of Rome, he annexed a portion of the land that they had. So he completely took them out and did away with it. Now, sort of thrown in here, after Gregory the Great and before the donation of Pippin, down in Jerusalem, the Muslims had taken control of Jerusalem. They had taken it away and I don't know that they sacked the city, but I think they definitely went in and took over the city to the point where it became a Muslim city, okay? That's important. So that brings us up to the point, there's a little bit of a gap here, but that brings us up to our next topic, bless you, our next topic, talking about the Crusades, okay? So all of that was getting to this. Hopefully that will kind of pull things together for you. All right, so the Crusades. This is another sort of controversial time frame. It just depends on who you read. The most consistent time frame was 1095 to 1291 is about the time frame of the Crusades. I read many sources that actually documented Crusades well into the 1600s and the 1500s. Apparently those are still, so a crusade is just the taking of land back for like Holy Land, bringing Holy Land back into possession of its intended recipient, if you want to call it that. So a crusade can certainly, generically speaking, keep going past this year of 1291 that I gave you. But the Crusades, whenever people are talking about the Crusades, it's limited to these 7 Crusades that are just recognized as grouping into that. Now, we're not going to talk about all the Crusades. We're just going to kind of hit the highlights of a few of them. So the Crusades, they began and ended in France. And when I mean begin and ended, I don't mean fighting. I mean the idea of forming a group of people to cross into the east and conquer peoples in order to take land back, in order to take lands back. Those ideas and those peoples and things like that were originated in France, and throughout the Crusades they continued and they ended with France as well. Now the Crusades are a pretty horrible time. They are, by most standards, they are a terrible blemish on Christianity. The Crusades in general took Christianity from being a religion that was thought of as loving and kind on some level to a religion of violence and hatred and actually no compassion at all for anyone else. It really darkened how outsiders, whether they're non-believers or whether they're just groups of people with different religious beliefs, all of those people were tainted, that's not true. Christianity was tainted for all of these people because of the Crusades. And it remains that way today. So there were 7 major crusades. There were lots and lots of minor crusades that happened throughout, but there were 7 major crusades. There were some crusading campaigns that went out that were not necessarily part of the plan, so to speak. So somebody would, and it was usually a pope, would get the idea to form a group of men and go on a crusade. They would have a plan where they were going, what city they were going to hit, why they were going to choose that city, how they were going to supply them with the food and the this and that they needed, and then bring them back. So in general, there was a plan. Outside of these 7 major crusades, they had all these little sort of splinter crusade groups that just sort of went and did what they did for the same reasons, but not necessarily under the same authority, okay? So, for example, your book talked about this, the People's Crusade. This was a group of people led by a man named Peter the Hermit. And the one thing that the People's Crusades were known for was they looked at the Jewish people as enemies of Christianity. And because they saw the Jewish people as invaders in what they would call their Holy Land or their Christian land, they were very mean to them. They were violent toward them. They, did terrible things to them, took their money, whatever. So in particular, this People's Crusade was not necessarily targeting Christians because they were heading for cities that were taken over by Muslims, but if they encountered Jewish people along the way, they did not hesitate to pour out their anger on them. And so they sort of left a long path of destruction in their wake as they made their way to Constantinople. And when they got to Constantinople, they caused quite a bit of trouble. The government inside of Constantinople was having to spend part of their resources dealing with this People's Crusade. And the Muslims ended up coming in and just wiping out this particular group of people. But before they were wiped out, the people in Constantinople, the government, so remember, the East and the West are not getting along, and here comes this group of people from the West who are claiming that they want to reclaim Christianity and do these good things. They cause all this trouble, and so now the government in Constantinople is very leery of the Crusaders because the people that got to them first, this group that was sort of representing the entire population of Crusaders, didn't behave themselves and got into a lot of trouble and caused problems for even Constantinople. And so now Constantinople's on high alert. So whenever other crusading groups come in, they're not welcoming them and saying, oh yes, we're going to help you, and oh yes, we're going to do this and do that. They're actually very leery of them, and they don't trust them, and they're not treating them like unify, like they're not acting like they want to unify and band together. And the Pope that started this first crusade, it was Pope Urban II. If you want to know that, you can. I won't test you on that. But Pope Urban II started, or sort of rallied around and starting this, sending out troops for this first crusade. The two things that he wanted to do, the two main objectives of the crusade, was to reclaim land and to reunite the Eastern and the Western churches. So this People's Crusade, and there may have been others, but this People's Crusade, by reaching Constantinople first and causing all these issues, sort of went against the plan. Instead of a way of unification, it actually sort of put up barriers that didn't even exist before the Crusaders went out. So who made up the crusading armies? Whenever they called people together, it was everybody was involved. You had kings and princes and governing authorities that were leading the charges out. You had, of course, men who were joining in and becoming crusaders and going out, laymen. You have knights that are trained military that are going out and doing it. And you have the church leaders who are sort of rallying everybody together and getting, people excited and trying to campaign for the Crusades. And anybody was allowed to join. Anybody and everybody could join a crusade. So even the people who had lesser, maybe moral value, people who really didn't care what the reason was, maybe they just had a bloodlust, didn't really matter. Everyone was involved in these crusades. Well, there were a couple of things that motivated, outside of these religious leaders, the popes and the monks and people like that coming out and saying, oh, you should be a part of the Crusades, it's, for love of country and on all these things. There were other motivating factors. So there were two specific motivating factors that the church set out to give people positive motivation for joining in a crusade. One of them was what's known as spiritual privilege or special indulgences, okay? The spiritual privileges, there were three of them. For anyone who would volunteer to fight willingly, any sin that they confessed would be instantly forgiven. So basically, it's if you're willing and you're able and you volunteer and your heart is in it and you confess your sin, it's forgiven. Okay? Number 2, anyone who joined in a crusade, they would never have to participate in penance ever again. No more penance for any person. And we'll talk about penance at the end of the night tonight, but they never have to participate or give sacrifice for their sins. Now, there were some people that wanted to be part of the Crusades but couldn't. They just were not physically capable or whatever. They just weren't able to do it. So for those people who couldn't actually go out on a crusade, there were special spiritual privileges for those too. If you were a parent and you willingly sent your son or even your daughter, if you willingly allowed your children to go, you would receive a special reward. And we're not talking about monetary, we're talking about spiritual rewards, like having your sins forgiven, not having to give penance, those kinds of rewards. If you were somebody who was a business owner and just couldn't leave, or your business would fail or whatever, if you gave supplies or money or gave weapons or anything like that, you would also be extended these special spiritual privileges. So everyone, literally everyone, could be involved in the Crusades if they were willing to do it. The second thing was, those were spiritual privileges, excuse me. Now there were also civil privileges. These were very enticing. They would entice people today for sure. They gave out civil exemptions. So people who went on a crusade, they would not have to pay taxes. They wouldn't have to pay interest. Many of them were completely relieved of their debt. And interestingly, now remember I was saying that some of the people, like everyone was allowed to be part of this, even people who maybe didn't behave themselves or were troublemakers or whatever. So one of the civil privileges you could attain is you could avoid prosecution for things that you have committed during the crusade, and sometimes even before the crusade. So if you had some sort of issue, if you had a legal problem, you were in trouble, you could say, I want to volunteer to go on a crusade. And not only was everything forgiven, but even the debt you would need to pay to society was also forgiven. So there were many privileges for joining the crusade, and it made it very appealing to everybody. All right. So this is basically the way that the First Crusade went, and this is very abbreviated, and it's just touching a couple of points. So first, the Crusaders went into Nicaea, and they captured Nicaea. And your book doesn't really talk too much about that, I don't think, but they go in and they capture Nicaea, so they already have a victory, okay? So from Nicaea, they moved to Antioch. Now, in that move, there were about 4,000 knights. This is just to give you an idea of how many people were moving across the land in order to get to Antioch. 4,000 knights, so that's trained military, and then about 25,000 infantry. So it's quite a few people. So they have a nice victory in Nicaea, and this entire group of people starts moving down toward Antioch. Well, they get to Antioch. They lay about a 6-month siege. And at the end of that 6 months, it's interesting what happens. How they end up breaching the city, somebody that was part of or a member of the Crusaders was talking with somebody who lived inside the city and talked them into basically unlocking the gate and opening it. So they talked somebody into basically being a traitor to the city. Now I realize one man can't open one of those huge gates, but I'm just saying. They basically found somebody who was willing to give up the city, and that person did what they needed to do, and the gates were opened. So then the Crusaders came in full force into the city, and when they got in there, they just massacred people. They took out not only the military presence or the fighting presence within the city, they took out women, they took out children, they took out animals. I mean, they wiped out, they didn't kill everybody in the city, but they absolutely took a serious toll on the city. And so it's one of the, if you read about the Crusades, it's one of the themes that just comes up over and over again, the overwhelming violence that is part of taking a city. So they definitely did that. Well, so they took Antioch, and then they rested for about 6 months or so, and then they set off for Jerusalem. Now, by the time they left for Jerusalem, and remember, they won this battle, but by the time they got to Jerusalem, they were down to about 1,200 knights. Now, they started out with 4,000, and they're down to about 1,200. And they started out with about 25,000 infantry fighters, and they're down to about 12,000. So they're taking, even though they are having victory, their ranks are taking a pretty big hit. Okay? So they laid siege around Jerusalem for about 5 weeks. Again, they ended up breaching a gate. I don't know if it was like it was in Antioch where somebody betrayed, but they ended up getting through a gate, and they went through and they just slaughtered tens of thousands of people. They slaughtered the fighting forces, which you kind of expect. I mean, they would come out fighting anyway, so you expect there to be death there, but they were killing civilians, Jewish civilians, Muslim civilians, whoever was in there. If you got in the way, they just took you out. So this first crusade, for all intents and purposes, was a victory. They took back the land that they were hoping to take. There's not really too much to be said about unification between the two churches, or the two representatives of the two halves of the empire, but the first crusade is considered a victory for Christianity. Now, one of the things to understand about this first crusade was the Muslim forces that they were fighting. The Muslim forces had all kinds of little branches. They had their own facets of different types or different populations of Muslims. They were fighting amongst themselves. They were having issues amongst themselves. And so then when the Crusaders came in, the disorganization that the Muslim fighting forces had at that time, it definitely contributed to their inability to defend themselves. And also, on the other hand, contributed to the victories that the Crusaders had. Well, some time passes. That first crusade, I don't know that I told you, the first crusade was from 1095 to 1099, so just a few years, okay? Jerusalem was taken and the crusade ended. Well, in 1147 to 1149, so this was a 2-year crusade. In 1147, the second major crusade happened. It was again initiated by a pope. And the reason that it was put together was because this Christian crusader city of Edessa had been taken by the Muslims. And when word got back, that was unacceptable. And so the Pope began to rally people around and form another group and go on another crusade to try to get Edessa back. Now, in this time frame between the first and second crusade, the Muslim armies, they got their act together. They reorganized. They were stronger and more effective because they were more organized. This second crusade was very, on the Christian side, the Crusaders themselves, they were very disorganized. They really didn't have things together very well. And so the second crusade, there really wasn't any Christian victory from it at all. It was basically a failure. Now it's interesting, I told you that the religious, some of the religious leaders were rallying people to try to get them to do these things. There was a monk, his name was Bernard of Clairvaux. It's interesting how, I'm going to read you 2 things that he said. So this first thing I'm going to read you, he said this during the Second Crusade, like while it was still happening, maybe toward the beginning, I'm not sure. But this is what he said. Pagans must not be slain if they may be by other means prevented from oppressing the faithful. However, it is better that they should be put to death than the rod of wickedness rest on the lot of the righteous. The religious fear no sin in killing the enemy of Christ. Christ's soldier can securely kill and more safely die. When he dies, it profits him. When he slays, it profits Christ. The Christian exults in the death of a pagan because Christ is glorified thereby. But when he himself is killed, he has reached his goal. So when I read this, basically what he's saying is, as a crusader, when you go out to battle, you don't have to worry about who you kill because you are edifying Christ in doing that. And if you're killed during the battle, you don't have to worry about that either because then you are edified and you are going to Christ, right? So there was this idea of, it actually reminded me, remember when we talked about during the apostolic age in the early church, whenever the martyrs were rushing into martyrdom, and they weren't having rallies. I mean, you didn't have anybody, bringing them together to try to get them to feel that way. But that's basically what this is saying. It's like, don't worry about it. You just go in and you do what you have to do, and you're going to be taken care of. So it was like a morale booster, right? Well, like I said, the Second Crusade didn't really go the way that they had hoped it would. And the same guy, at the end, after the crusade was over, he said, "The struggle is a better one, which is waged against the sinful lust of the heart than was the struggle to conquer Jerusalem." So basically what he's saying is we need to fix the heart issue that's happening here because violence isn't working. Like we're trying to go in and take it by force, and however you want to say it, we're trying to force people to be Christian, we're trying to force people to be good, we're trying to keep people from being wicked. I mean, however you want to look at it. He basically, by the end of the Second Crusade, went from go get them to, well, we have a real issue here that violence really isn't fixing. So, and that's only two of the things he said. This is not his total stance on the Crusades. I'm just saying that he went from one go get 'em stance to we have a different issue here than what we started out having. And I think that's very insightful. It was a very interesting thing. So he was basically saying that these false religions, they can't be converted by violence. They really need to have, just like all of us, they need to have a gentle persuasion. They need to believe what they believe and not be forced to believe what they believe. Well, so the Second Crusade didn't work very well. That ended it, like I said, in 1149. Well, by 1187, Jerusalem was again taken by the Muslims. Okay? So, because Jerusalem was taken, the Third Crusade was initiated, and that lasted from 1189 to 1192. So again, just a few years. It was launched or initiated specifically to try to recover Jerusalem. Because remember, there were two main goals for the Crusades. One was to reunify the church, and the other was to regain the Holy Lands. And Jerusalem has always been a center or a holy land that everyone wants to own, right? So when Jerusalem was taken again, it initiated this Third Crusade. But again, this crusade really wasn't successful. The Crusaders did gain some lands back, but they did not regain Jerusalem. So by the end of the Third Crusade and the failure that came with that, it was very apparent to at least the people who were initiating these things that violence is not working to regain these lands that they wanted to have back. All right, so that's the first three crusades. The first one was pretty successful, the second two, not so much. All right, well then, in February of 1198, a man was elected to be pope. His name was Pope Innocent III. He's very important. He's somebody that you're going to want to know about, somebody that he was responsible for a few important things. So he was consecrated or inaugurated or placed as Pope in February of 1198. By October of 1198, he began to, and this is kind of a retrospective summary of what he did, he began to administrate or express his authority over those papal states. Okay? He started to reach his authority out from Rome and really start reaching out into the imperial part of the empire, or what was left of it. It was already pretty much gone, but that area. So he was not a monk. He was a lawyer. He was a canon lawyer. And many believe that the decisions that he made and the sort of the legacy that he has left is in part due to the fact that he was, instead of being a monk, he was a lawyer. So for a way to be efficient, he was more interested in the law than he was interested in people's hearts or the love that comes with Christianity or with being a monk. So many people believe that the decisions that he made that were very different from previous popes were because of his background, not being a monk and being a lawyer. So these cities that belonged in these papal states, what he was doing, he was basically reaching out to these leaders, the leaders in these cities in the papal states, and he was recruiting their loyalty, basically recruiting their loyalty. And it was interesting because, again, now he's only been the Pope for a few months, and what he's done is many of those leaders have promised loyalty to him. And what he did was he said, these people who have promised their loyalty to Rome, they're like the moon. And Rome, or me, the Pope, I'm like the sun. And just like the moon gets its light from the sun, you all will receive your authority from me. And so he began, because they pledged his loyalty, he began to extend his administrative authority. Okay? So once he kind of started reaching out to the papal states, he then started even reaching out beyond that. He started really reaching out of his area and going into other countries even. And he used two things to gain and to maintain control over other leaders. Okay? The first thing that he would do, it was what he would do to an individual. He would excommunicate them. So remember, all of this is all about the ability to go to church, take communion, be absolved, have your penance given to you, all these things, right? So you have an entire world, his entire world is seeking after that. So for him, if you were a person who was not doing what you were supposed to be doing, you were breaking a moral law, whatever. If you were not behaving the way you were supposed to behave, for example, he may say, stop doing that or start doing that, whatever it is. If you say, I'm not going to stop, or I'm not going to start, then what he would do is say, well, you're excommunicated then. And until you can behave yourself, you can't take communion and you're going to hell. So that was very, very effective with the people because they wanted and needed the things that he was taking away from them. So that was the individual control. He also took control over entire countries using what is known as an interdict. An interdict is basically the excommunication of an entire nation or an entire population or a city, just a group of people. It can be as small as a city, it can be as large as a country. So then what would happen is he would be in negotiation with a king. You can pick on some country, you can pick on France, whatever. He decides, he and the king of France are in negotiations over something, and he wants France to do something. And they say no. And he says, okay, well, I excommunicate you. Well, the king of France may not care. And so he says, well, fine, you can excommunicate me. I'm still not going to do this thing that you want me to do. And he says, okay, well, fine, I excommunicate France. Like all of you. None of you can have any more anything. Well, then the people start freaking out. Whenever the people are not allowed to take communion, the people are not allowed to take the sacraments, the people are not allowed to even enter a church, and I don't know, the book sort of mentioned it. When you're excommunicated, what they would do is the Pope or the bishop, some authority, they would open this big book and they would read from it. I don't know what they read, but they would read from it. And at the end, they would pronounce the name of the person who's been excommunicated. They would extinguish a candle, ring a death bell. I like ring the bell that you would ring if someone died, slam the book shut, and we're talking, in a church, when you slam something shut, it echoes through the whole place, so it's very dramatic. So they extinguish a candle, they ring the bell, they close the book, and then the person's walked out, and the people who are left, you're not allowed to talk to them. You're not allowed to do business with them. They're dead to you. You can't be part of a contract. You can't own property. You can't buy property. You can't, nothing. You've lost everything when you're excommunicated. So even if you don't care about heaven or hell, your civil life is over when you get excommunicated. Well, then you extend that to an entire country where the king just doesn't want to do something. And so so then he ends up getting the entire country excommunicated. Well, then the people start revolting and they're like, I don't think so. You give him what he wants because I don't want to go to hell, or I want to be able to buy a car, or I don't want to lose my business, or whatever it is that motivates people. So these were extremely powerful tools that he was using. They worked. And I think your book, I don't remember what the number was, but it was at the bottom of one of the pages. It was something like 87 threats of interdict or something is what he put out during his time in the papacy. He used it. So anyway, when he came into office like it's elected, whatever. When he became Pope, he extended papal authority well beyond the religious boundaries that had been established before. He went well beyond those, and not just regional, he went national. And he controlled individuals and countries with these threats of excommunication, whether it's individual or entire populations. So he had a lasting effect on things. He was trying to bring what he believed was a proper Christian lifestyle to everybody. So basically, you did what he said, or you got X'd. So Innocent is in the papacy, and he initiates the Fourth Crusade. Now, it's interesting. So remember, I actually don't know if I read in a couple of places that Pope Innocent III was interested in reuniting the church. So it's interesting, given that this story that I'm about to tell you. So basically, Constantinople. There's a little bit of background here. Constantinople has a ruler. His name is Emperor Alexis III. That's not important, but you can write it down. Emperor Alexis III. He is strongly Byzantine. He is an Eastern Orthodox, strongly Eastern Christian, just like you'd expect if you were living in Constantinople, leader. Well, his nephew, Alexis IV, is more sympathetic to Rome. Okay? So, Pope Innocent III, one of the things that he wanted to accomplish with this Fourth Crusade was deposing Alexis III and bringing in Alexis IV so that there would be unification. That was his idea, I believe. That was his idea, was to have this unification, because you would have a leader that is sympathetic to your own desires. Well, so he gathers all these people together, and they take off, right? The crusade begins, and they start taking off toward Constantinople. Well, he had made a deal with the Venetians to supply ships if they needed them, but more importantly, to supply supplies, food and other things that they would need when they got there. Well, the Crusaders showed up. The Venetians are there. They have what they promised. The problem is that this crusade wasn't as successful as what they thought it was going to be in recruitment, or maybe they lost some people on their way, whatever. There were fewer people that showed up to talk to the Venetians and collect those supplies than what was originally told to them. So basically what I'm saying is, Innocent says, okay, Venetians, I'm just going to make up numbers to make it easy. I'm going to have 1,000 people come to you. So I need enough supplies and blah, blah, blah for 1,000 people. Well, the Crusaders take off. They meet up with the Venetians, but there's only 500 of them. So for whatever reason, the ranks were lower than the supplies that they were told to bring. And so they don't need that much food by any stretch. They don't need as many supplies as what is being offered. And 2, they can't pay for all those supplies even if they needed them. There's no way that they can pay for twice the supplies they would need, right? And I'm making up the numbers. It's not halves or twifes or anything like that. It's just a big difference. Well, the Venetians are now irritated because they've held up their end of the bargain. They brought what they were supposed to bring, and it's really not their problem that the troop number isn't there or that the money that you thought you were going to have isn't there. They don't really care. And so now they're effectively irritated. So they're holding this debt over the Crusaders. And they say, okay, well, instead of paying the full debt, this is what you can do. You can go into this little town, this little Christian town called Zara, and you can take it. You can take control of that town. Now, I don't know what the deal is, but the book only gives an illusion. It just says the town gave problems to the Venetians. I didn't research it, so I don't know what those problems were, but they were significant enough that the Venetians were willing to settle the debt of the extra supplies and the money that they didn't have if they would take care of the city. So they did. The Crusaders went in and they took care of the city. Well, as all of this was happening, the Alexis IV did end up becoming emperor in Constantinople. So you have this Roman, or this emperor in Constantinople that is now sympathetic to the Romans, and now you have the Crusaders coming in. It seems like exactly what they wanted to have happen, this unification, this same idea. The problem is that the people in Constantinople, they were not. They were fully Eastern Orthodox and Byzantine in culture and mind and action and belief. So just because their one ruler, apparently he was all by himself, just because their one ruler wanted to start negotiations or start having sympathy or whatever, however you want to say it, with Rome, the people were not going to have it. So they staged a coup and strangled him. So now he's gone. Okay? So then the Crusaders find out about this, and they come in and they absolutely sack Constantinople. They come in and they ravage the city. They do things that you would never expect, given that this is supposed to be the other half of their own Christianity. Like, it's a split, but their brother they're supposed to be trying to unify with. They loot the city. They destroy. They steal. They violate. They defile. They get a hold of the city's most holy places and just defile and ruin them. They do terrible things to the women in the city. They violate everything they come across. They're killing, they're raping, they're destroying. They just absolutely take the city. Well, when Innocent finds out about this, that was not the plan. They were not supposed to do that. When Innocent finds out about Zara and also about Constantinople, he finds out about Zara first. When he finds out about Zara, he excommunicates everybody. He's so angry, he excommunicates everybody. But then he gives this conditional absolution clause, basically, to the Crusaders only, not the Venetians. The Venetians are out. But the Crusaders, they still have a sort of a partial absolution that they can participate in. Well, then they went into Constantinople and just absolutely destroyed this sacking of Constantinople by the Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade. It was what history says inevitably rips apart the East and the West, and it's unrecoverable. And even to this day, the Eastern Orthodox, and I'm being very general, Eastern Orthodoxy views Christianity in general very poorly because of this event. So it was definitely a game changer. The rest of the Crusades, the 5th, 6th, and 7th Crusades, they became really less about reclaiming Holy Land, like what they were supposed to be at the beginning, and they became more about almost just being right. They sort of became, I'm going to assert my authority over you in whatever way I need to win this battle. They didn't care who you were, what religion you were, whether you were a fighter or not. They just sort of came in and blanketly were violent, and it just didn't work out very well. And there are Jewish people, there are Eastern Orthodoxy people, there are secular people who view Christianity very, very negatively and say, just have a terrible opinion of Christianity, and it all dates back to the Crusades. It's still a blemish, and it's still something that we are having to face and deal with. So to kind of wrap things up, primary reason again for the Crusades, 2 things: reclaim Holy Land and unify the church. So if those are the 2 things that we are saying were the reason for the Crusades, then you can effectively say the Crusades were a total failure because neither thing was accomplished. They never got Jerusalem back again during the Crusades, and they absolutely solidified the rip and the rift between the Eastern and the Western churches. So it just really was bad. Some of the lessons, a couple of the lessons that were learned by generically speaking, by Christianity is the possession of special places, the possession of land, is not a guarantee of success. Like the Crusaders were assuming that if they had the Holy Land, they would be successful, like one depended on the other. And that was deposed after the Crusades were finished. And the other thing that came through was that, in general, war is not the way that God unifies his church. It's not the way he extends Christ to an unsaved world. War is just certainly not the first way that God would choose to do that. So there were some lessons that were learned. It's just unfortunate that while we're learning lessons, we're just going to continue to reap the consequences of the Crusades. Now, one of the things that came through, what time is it? Okay. One of the things that came throughout the Crusades, one thing that happened was a huge rise in monasticism. The monks and the different orders, huge rise. The reason for that is that the monks played a major role throughout this time frame of the Crusades. They had a role in several different areas. First of all, the monks always supported the Pope. So they always had the support of the Pope. That helped. But for the Crusades, they were major promoters for them, just like that Bernard of Clairvaux that I mentioned earlier. There were lots of spokesmen and lots of people who were promoting it. So they were just a main player in the Crusades in that way. In the universities, they became teachers. They became some of the primary teachers in the universities. They helped to plan and design different cathedrals around the empire. It's funny, one of the things that I found out, these cathedrals, they were sort of the center seat in the city, like where the bishop would be and where he'd teach from and whatever. And the cathedrals, when they first started, since they were started by these or employed by these monks, it was usually an order that established the ruling party. It was a Benedictine cathedral or an Augustinian cathedral or whatever. At some point during this Crusades, and I don't know when it happened, a sort of a branch started to take place where you had some cathedrals who were still sticking to that, but they became more secularized. And instead of having the Benedictine vows in order to be a part of this, they were just statutes. You would have to take a vow to go into it, but it wasn't a Benedictine vow or an Augustinian vow. It was just, okay, I promise to do this. And then you'd get to be part of it. And then you were just governed by almost like a constitution, almost, just a series of laws. So there was sort of a breach, and some of them remained very monk-like, and some of them sort of went a more secular path. It was interesting. But anyway, and the last thing that helped to pump up monasticism was this idea of scholasticism, and that was that whole chapter 20. The only thing that you really need to know about scholasticism is that this is basically a merging of two thoughts. So you have logical thought or philosophy, and then you have faith or theology. And many people at this time, and even still today, many people see those two things as two things that cannot blend together. They can't complement one another at all. They're too separate and too different. This scholasticism, this was a school of thought or a way of teaching that blended them together. And there were the one person they mentioned in the book, this Thomas Aquinas, he sought to reconcile the sort of gorge that had been built between reason and faith. And he didn't see them as contradictory at all. He said that God created both of them, and therefore they would support one another. So one of the quotes I found said, he believed that revelation could guide reason and prevent it from making a mistake, while reason could clarify and demystify faith. So while they were completely separate entities, they would work together in harmony and produce positive results. And he wrote an entire book, they mention it, the Summa Theologica. He wrote this book and summarized all of his understanding, and all of that is scholasticism. So it's just this melding of two what were considered separate things working in harmony together. Okay? So monks were basically the bomb. And it was at this time, by the end of, by the 11th and 12th centuries, it was a very prestigious thing to be a monk. People were aspiring to be a monk. They wanted to join monasteries. They wanted to be in the cathedrals. They wanted to be part of the whole monastic lifestyle because it was prestigious. Well, it became so prestigious that the monkeries were sort of drawing religion away from the Vatican. They were becoming not more religious, but they were becoming just as important as what the Vatican was. And people were it's almost like religion was moving from the Vatican into the monkeries. Well, and they were taking money from the government. Of course, they were being taxed, but there was an economy in these in this monastic lifestyle now. Many of these monks appeared to be born again. Many of them taught about, loved, and promoted Jesus in a very positive manner. But in 1215 AD, this is so interesting. In 1215 AD, this is still Pope Innocent. He's still in the papacy. The Fourth Lateran Council is called in 1215 AD. Now, this Lateran Council, it had many, many agenda items. There are several things that came out of this council. One of which is that he declared that no new monastic orders can be formed. So no new monkeries can be formed because it's too expensive and it's taking too much money. That was the biggest reason. So he basically stopped the building or creation, however you want to think of it, of new monkeries. Well, that was in 1215. In 1216, Pope Innocent III dies. The same year he died, 2 new orders were created. All right? Well, one of them. The same year, the Dominican order was started, and by 1223, the Franciscan order was started. So even though out of that Lateran Council, he had stopped this idea of forming, the very year he died, the Dominicans formed a new monastic order. Now these two, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, it's interesting, they're very different from one another. In general, if you were to compare and contrast them. So Dominic Guzman, he was the founder, and he's from Spain. He's the founder of the Dominicans. And Francis Bernardone, I don't know if that's how you say his last name, he's from France, and he started the Order of the Franciscans, okay? This stuff is in your book. Those names are in your book. So on one side, the Dominicans, in general, they were kind of a systematic, and because they were so systematic and so orderly, they were sometimes perceived as cold, sort of just a systematic order, whereas the Franciscans were viewed as a very gentle and warm, and sometimes it's called, they're characterized as unpretentious. So whereas the Dominicans were very systematic and orderly and sort of maybe harsh, the Franciscans were very gentle and very laid back, basically. The Dominicans, they were master disciplinarians. They just believed in order. And the Franciscans were more concerned with mingling with the people. They wanted to be out and about and less about order and more about people. The Dominicans, they perpetuated the integrity of Catholic doctrine. That's fine. They perpetuate this doctrine, but they were known as hammers of heretics. So while they perpetuated doctrine, they were kind of known for doing it in a harsh way, whereas the Franciscans were known for their humbleness of mind. They had a humble walk. They had a humble lifestyle. They liked working in the community. They were just people. They were all about people. So you kind of had these two there's kind of a harsh order and kind of a soft order, right? And so they were very different from each other. Even though they were different from each other, these two orders, they were different from all the other orders that had been into existence up to this point. They had 5 things that separated them, even though they were very different from each other. 5 things separated them from the other orders. One was they lived in absolute poverty all the time. They were called mendicants. They were people who went out and begged, and then everything that they received while they were begging went directly to the poor. They didn't keep any of it. So they were called beggars. And other orders would look at these two, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. They would look at these two orders, and they would see them begging on the streets, and they did not like it at all. They were completely against it. They kind of saw it as uncouth and just no way to behave. It's no way for a person to behave unless they just have to. But that's what they did. They believed in absolute poverty. They would beg and give everything they had to the poor. They didn't beg for themselves ever. They was always to give to somebody else. They always participated in practical activities in society, like they were always farming, they were always building, they were always expanding their knowledge. And because they would be sometimes on the cutting edge of whatever it was that they were doing. They would, if they were farming, they would have cutting edge ways of doing their work, and they would be very successful at it. These two orders would allow non-monks to be part of their monasteries. these people, these non-monks, it's almost like, what did they call it? The people who serve, but they only go like one weekend a month. What are they called? Like the reserves. It's almost like that's almost like the same idea. These people were not monks, but they would be allowed to work during the week. They'd just carry on their normal lives during the week, and then on the weekends they would go into the monkeries and they would work and do all the stuff and contribute to whichever order they were contributing to. None of the other orders would allow someone who was not a monk into the monastery to work. So that was very unique. They were also the teachers in the universities that I mentioned earlier. It was these two orders that produced monks that taught in the universities. And of course, they vowed allegiance to the Pope. I think I don't know that was different from the other orders, though. So in these Middle Ages, the monks that I would like you to know, so we've already talked about some of the monks of the earlier times. We talked about Anthony and Gregory and Augustine. But for the Middle Ages, the three monks that I'd like you to know are Thomas Aquinas for his for scholasticism and his viewpoints there, and then Dominic Guzman and the order that he started, the order that he started, and then Francis Bernardone, who started the Franciscans. So those are the three monks I want you to know for the Middle Ages. All right, this is the last thing, like 5 more minutes. It is so hot in here. Okay. This is going to be the bridge, this is beginning the bridge into the Reformation. So I'm just giving you a little bit of background here. So in the Middle Ages, they had specific doctrines. Some of these I've already kind of laid mention to earlier, but they had certain doctrines, 2 of which I want you to know. One of them is baptism. To them in the Middle Ages, baptism was the reason that you were baptized was that it would remove original sin. So baptism was necessary for salvation. It removed original sin and allowed you to have the opportunity to avoid hell. The other thing is penance. Now what penance does, so baptism takes care of everything from before until the time you're baptized. Penance takes care of everything from the time you're baptized until you pass away. So penance, it basically deletes mortal sins that you commit after you're baptized. It's a way to get rid of that sin. This was a chief concern of the people. They wanted to be able to be absolved. They wanted to have a way. And these things, baptism and penance, especially penance, the willingness to give penance, it became a way for the priesthood to secure authority over the people, over the flock that they were responsible for. So there were certain requirements that you had to meet in order to receive forgiveness from the early church or the Middle Age church. One requirement was you had to be sorry, you had to be contrite, you had to basically be truly repentant against what you are confessing. Secondly, you had to take that sin that you were repenting from and confess it to a priest. That was required. Then the priest, after your confession, would prescribe a series of good works that, if you completed, would absolve you from that sin. Once that was accomplished, the priest would then grant you absolution. So there were 4 steps, basically. You had to be sorry, you had to confess it, you had to perform the work or works that were given to you by your priest after confession, and at the conclusion of that, the priest would absolve your sin. Okay? Now, because of these requirements, because this is what you needed to do to have your sins forgiven, there became a practice. A practice started being done in the Middle Ages. It was another way for you to have like another work almost. So this work that the priest would give you to absolve for your absolution, it would be a sacrifice on some level. There were new sacrifices that were added in. They were called, but you ended up paying for them. They weren't necessarily something you went into and confessed and then you were told, say this, do this. They weren't actions. This was actually paying money. It was a monetary sacrifice that you would give to the church in order to be forgiven. That was called an indulgence. That's an important thing for you to know. The selling of indulgences began in the Middle Ages. It became common practice, and not only could you have your sins absolved during your lifetime by paying an indulgence, you could even have the sins of your family who had already died, who are in purgatory, you can have their sentences reduced if you paid an indulgence for it. So it became something very important. There was a Dominican friar named John Tetzel. We'll talk about him later. He sold indulgences, and this is the final thing. So John Tetzel was going around collecting indulgences. The money that he was collecting was being used to fund different things like building St. Peter's Basilica, blah, blah, right? Just being used to do different things. A monk from Germany heard about this. His name was Martin Luther. He heard about this selling of indulgences and understood that you could basically buy your way out of sin. So you could do something, and if you had enough money, you could buy your way out of it, and then you would be forgiven. Martin Luther found out about this concept, and he absolutely disagreed with it. Thanks, guys. See you later. He disagreed with it, and he so greatly disagreed with it that he wrote something called the 95 Theses and nailed it to the church wall or to the church door in order to initiate a debate with the Pope to discuss the validity of collecting money for absolving people of their sins. So it became a real issue. And that issue will take us into the Reformation, not next week, but the week after. So, actually after the first of the year. So I just want to make sure that you understand why it's important. The people of the time needed these things. They needed to have penance, and they needed to have absolution. They needed this from the papacy in order for them to be saved. And so then okay, you can be saved if you pay. And so it was just sort of the way things evolved, and it began to cause a lot of problems outside of the papacy. So that's what I wanted you to know about that. And that's it, you guys.